December 1947. A 28-year-old Soviet sergeant named Mikhail Kalashnikov stands in a frozen weapons facility outside Moscow, watching generals test his creation. The rifle fires, and fires, and fires. Through mud, sand, ice, and neglect, it never stops. Within 30 years, this simple weapon would arm over 100 million people across 80 countries, more than any firearm in human history. It would outlast the empire that created it. It would become the weapon of choice for both liberators and terrorists, for governments and guerrillas, for heroes and war criminals. But here's the question almost no one asks. How did a rifle designed by a wounded tank commander with no formal engineering training become more influential than nuclear weapons in shaping modern conflict? And why, after 77 years and hundreds of competing designs, has nothing replaced it?
Mikhail Kalashnikov didn't set out to become history's most successful weapons designer. In October 1941, he was simply trying to survive. The 22-year-old tank commander lay in a field hospital near Bryansk, his left shoulder shattered by German shell fragments. Around him, other wounded Soviet soldiers told stories that haunted him more than his own injuries. They spoke of German machine guns that worked flawlessly in the brutal Russian winter, while Soviet weapons froze and jammed. They described watching their comrades die not from better German tactics, but from superior German engineering. Kalashnikov had always been mechanically inclined. The son of Siberian peasants who'd been exiled to Kazakhstan, he'd taught himself machinery repair and even designed improvements to Soviet tanks before the war. But lying in that hospital bed, listening to those stories, he became consumed by a single question. Why couldn't the Soviet Union build a weapon that worked as reliably as a German MP-40, but was simpler, tougher, and easier to manufacture? Here's the paradox that would define everything that followed. The Soviet military establishment didn't want simple. They wanted sophisticated, precision, refinement. The existing Soviet doctrine favored rifles like the Tokarev SVT-40, a semi-automatic weapon that required trained operators, regular maintenance, and careful handling. It was a rifle for professional soldiers, not for the millions of conscripts and partisans the Soviet Union was desperately trying to arm. Military designers in Moscow believed that firepower meant complexity, that stopping power required careful engineering. Kalashnikov, with no formal education beyond 7 years of rural schooling, thought the opposite. He believed the perfect weapon wasn't the one that performed best under ideal conditions. It was the one that never failed under the worst conditions. By 1944, while still recovering from his wounds, he'd sketched dozens of designs. His early prototypes were crude, assembled from salvaged parts in primitive workshops. The Soviet weapons establishment rejected them repeatedly. Too simple, they said. Not accurate enough. Too much recoil. The design wasn't sophisticated enough for modern warfare. But Kalashnikov had noticed something his critics missed. Sophistication was a luxury. Soviet factories were being overrun by German advances. Skilled workers were dying by the millions. The USSR didn't need weapons that impressed engineers in laboratories. They needed weapons that illiterate farmers could operate in frozen trenches at 3 in the morning. Then came a moment that changed everything. In 1946, the Soviet military issued a competition for a new automatic rifle, inspired by intelligence reports about German development of the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. The specifications seemed impossible. The weapon had to fire automatically, remain controllable during sustained bursts, work in temperatures from -40 degrees Celsius to +50 degrees Celsius, survive being buried in mud and sand, and be simple enough for minimally trained soldiers to field strip and reassemble in darkness.
Kalashnikov submitted his design, designated the Avtomat Kalashnikova Model 1947, or AK-47. It didn't look impressive. It wasn't elegant. Compared to competing designs from established weapons bureaus, it seemed almost crude. But when the testing began, something extraordinary happened. While other rifles jammed in cold weather tests, the AK-47 fired continuously. When testers buried other weapons in sand, they seized up. The AK-47 kept working. Other designs required careful cleaning and maintenance. The AK-47 functioned even after being submerged in swamp water for days. The secret wasn't sophistication. It was tolerance. Kalashnikov had designed every component with loose tolerances, allowing dirt, sand, ice, and debris to pass through the mechanism without stopping it. Where other designers saw imprecision, Kalashnikov saw resilience. Where they demanded tight engineering, he built in space for failure. Here's what still puzzles historians. Did Kalashnikov deliberately create these loose tolerances as a design philosophy? Or were they simply the limitations of his crude manufacturing methods that accidentally became the weapon's greatest strength? Even Kalashnikov himself gave contradictory answers throughout his life. But by 1949, the Soviet military had made its decision. They chose Kalashnikov's design over submissions from dozens of experienced weapons bureaus. Production began at the Izmash factory in central Russia. What no one predicted, not even Kalashnikov, was what would happen when this weapon left Soviet control. How does a rifle designed for Soviet conscripts become the global symbol of revolution, terrorism, and guerrilla warfare? And why would the weapon's creator spend the last decades of his life haunted by what he'd made?
The AK-47 might have remained a footnote in Soviet military history, just another weapon in an endless Cold War arms race. But in 1955, the Kremlin made a decision that would reshape global conflict for generations. They gave the design away. Not sold, given, to anyone willing to oppose the West. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev recognized that the AK-47 possessed a unique quality. It was what military strategists now call democratized lethality. A weapon so simple and reliable that even poorly trained insurgents could use it effectively against professional armies. The first foreign production began in China in 1956, designated the Type 56. Egypt followed in 1957, then East Germany, Poland, Yugoslavia, North Korea, and eventually over 30 countries. The Soviets didn't just share the blueprints. They built factories, trained workers, and helped establish entire production ecosystems. Here's the staggering statistic. By 1960, more AK-47s existed than all other military rifles in the world combined. By 1970, that number exceeded 30 million. Today, credible estimates suggest between 100 and 150 million AK pattern rifles exist globally. Roughly one for every 52 people on Earth. But numbers don't explain influence. To understand why the AK-47 became unstoppable, you need to understand what happened in Vietnam. December 1963. A U.S. military advisory team in the Mekong Delta examines weapons captured from Viet Cong fighters. The Americans are carrying M14 rifles, precision instruments designed for trained marksmen, weighing 11 pounds, firing heavy .308 caliber rounds with significant recoil. Effective range, 800 meters. But the jungle fighting rarely exceeds 100 meters, and the M14 jams constantly in Vietnam's humidity and monsoon rains. The captured Viet Cong weapons are AK-47s. They're lighter. They fire a smaller 7.62 by 39 millimeter round that's easier to control in automatic mode. Most importantly, they work after being carried through rice paddies, buried in mud, and stored in underground tunnels with 95% humidity. American soldiers began doing something unprecedented in military history. They started preferring enemy weapons over their own issue rifles. Field reports document U.S. troops discarding M14s and using captured AKs instead. This created a bizarre paradox. American forces fighting with Soviet-designed weapons against an enemy supplied by Moscow. The Pentagon's response was to develop the M16, lighter, higher velocity, more sophisticated. But the early M16s were plagued by jamming problems. Soldiers died because their rifles seized up mid-firefight. Meanwhile, the AK-47 kept working. Here's the question that military historians still debate. Did the AK-47's reliability actually change the outcome of conflicts? Or did its psychological impact matter more than its ballistic performance? Consider the evidence. The AK-47 isn't particularly accurate. Beyond 200 meters, it's significantly less precise than Western rifles. Its 7.62 by 39 millimeter round has less range and penetration than NATO standard ammunition. In technical specifications, it's inferior to dozens of competing designs. Yet every insurgency, revolution, and guerrilla movement from the 1960s onward adopted it as their primary weapon. The Viet Cong, Palestinian Liberation Organization, African National Congress, Nicaraguan Sandinistas, Afghan Mujahideen. The list encompasses virtually every non-state military force of the last 60 years. Why? Because the AK-47 solved a problem that Western weapons designers didn't even recognize existed.
Modern militaries assumed soldiers would have regular access to cleaning supplies, replacement parts, trained armorers, climate-controlled storage, and consistent ammunition quality. The AK-47 assumed soldiers would have none of these things. It was designed for the real conditions of warfare, not the theoretical conditions in military procurement manuals. An AK-47 can fire thousands of rounds without cleaning and still function. It can be assembled from mismatched parts from different decades and different countries, a Chinese receiver, a Polish barrel, a Romanian bolt carrier, and still work. You can literally bury it in sand for months, dig it up, shake it off, and fire it. No Western military rifle can make that claim. This created what economists call a network effect. The more AK-47s that existed globally, the more valuable each individual AK-47 became, because ammunition, parts, and expertise were universally available. A guerrilla fighter in Afghanistan could find 7.62 by 39 millimeter ammunition anywhere. A rebel in Africa could scavenge parts from weapons manufactured 40 years apart on different continents. But here's the deeply troubling paradox that would haunt Mikhail Kalashnikov for the rest of his life. He designed a weapon to defend the Soviet Union from fascism. Instead, he created the perfect tool for every form of political violence imaginable. By 1970, the AK-47 had become something its creator never intended, not just a military weapon, but a symbol. It appeared on the flags of Mozambique and Hezbollah. It became a status symbol for warlords and terrorists. It was the weapon of choice for child soldiers in Sierra Leone, drug cartels in Mexico, and extremist groups across the Middle East. Kalashnikov watched from Russia as his creation became associated with every cause and atrocity imaginable. He received awards and honors from the Soviet government. They made him a hero of socialist labor. They gave him a comfortable apartment and a modest pension. But they never paid him royalties. Because Soviet patent law didn't recognize individual ownership of military designs, Kalashnikov never received a single ruble beyond his factory salary for creating the world's most proliferated weapon. Meanwhile, hundreds of factories across dozens of countries manufactured millions of rifles bearing his name, and he saw none of the profits. In 1990, after the Soviet Union's collapse, a reporter asked the 71-year-old Kalashnikov how he felt about his rifle's global proliferation. He gave an answer that revealed his growing anguish. "I wish I'd invented a lawnmower instead. But by then, it was far too late. The weapon had escaped any possibility of control, and it was about to enter the most dangerous phase of its existence, the era of conflict without states, without rules, and without end." What happens when the world's most reliable weapon becomes available to anyone with $300? And can the man who created it find any peace knowing what his invention has enabled?
There's a moment in 1991 that perfectly captures the AK-47's transition from military weapon to global commodity. Soviet Army Lieutenant Alexander Lebed stands in a Ukrainian warehouse staring at rows of rifles stacked floor to ceiling, literally millions of them. The Soviet Union is collapsing, military units are dissolving, soldiers are deserting, taking their weapons with them. And no one is keeping track. Within months, those warehouses would be empty. The weapons would flood into black markets across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. A rifle that cost the Soviet military 40 rubles to manufacture would now sell for $10 in Afghan border markets. By the mid-1990s, in some African conflict zones, you could buy an AK-47 for less than the price of a chicken. This is when the weapon's true genius became apparent, not as a military tool, but as an economic phenomenon. The AK-47 destroyed the traditional economics of warfare. Historically, sustaining armed conflict required enormous resources, complex supply chains, industrial manufacturing capacity, trained logistics personnel, and substantial capital. Wars were expensive. Only states could afford them. The AK-47 changed that calculation entirely. Consider the numbers. A modern Western assault rifle like the M4 costs approximately $700 to $1,000 per unit for military procurement. It requires regular maintenance, specialized tools, climate-controlled storage, and trained armorers. Ammunition must be relatively high quality to prevent jamming. Total life cycle cost: $3,000 to $5,000 per weapon. An AK-47 purchased on the black market costs $100 to $400 depending on region. It requires virtually no maintenance. It functions with ammunition manufactured anywhere in the world, including corroded rounds from the 1960s. It can be stored in a hole in the ground for years and still work. Total life cycle cost: essentially the purchase price. This price differential created what economists call a disruptive innovation, a technology so cheap and accessible that it undermines established market leaders not through superior performance, but through radical affordability. Here's the paradox this created. The AK-47 made violence affordable for anyone, which meant that conflicts that would have ended from economic exhaustion now continued indefinitely. Small arms experts estimate that over 250,000 people die annually from AK pattern rifle fire, more casualties than from all other small arms combined. Not because it's the most lethal weapon, but because it's the most available. The weapon became the foundation of entire informal economies. In Afghanistan during the 1990s, the tribal arms markets in Dara Adam Kel manufactured functional AK-47 copies using hand tools in dirt floor workshops. These weren't precision instruments, but they worked. A farmer could spend $30 for a locally made Kalashnikov copy that would last decades. In Africa, the AK-47 became a form of currency. More stable than cash, more portable than gold, and universally accepted. Warlords paid soldiers in AK-47s. Militia groups traded them for supplies. In some regions, bride prices were quoted in Kalashnikovs.
But the weapon's economic impact went deeper than simple proliferation. It fundamentally altered the nature of political power. Traditionally, governments maintained control through monopoly on violence. Only the state had access to military-grade weapons. The AK-47 broke that monopoly. For the first time in modern history, non-state actors could arm themselves with weapons nearly equivalent to government forces. A peasant uprising in Mozambique could access the same rifles carried by professional armies. This leveling effect created what political scientists call asymmetric warfare, conflicts where technologically superior conventional forces lose to inferior but more motivated insurgents. Vietnam. Afghanistan, twice, first Soviet, then American. Somalia. Iraq. In each case, forces armed primarily with AK-47s fought superpowers to a standstill. The weapon's impact on global stability was profound and destabilizing. Between 1991 and 2005, the number of active armed conflicts globally increased by 43%. Not coincidentally, this period corresponded exactly with the flood of surplus Soviet weapons into black markets worldwide. The AK-47 didn't cause these conflicts, but it made them possible, sustainable, and impossible to resolve militarily. Here's the question that tormented weapons analysts and humanitarian organizations. Was there any way to control a weapon that existed in such enormous quantities, could be manufactured anywhere, and lasted virtually forever?
The United Nations tried.
Between 1998 and 2006, they implemented weapons buyback programs across Africa, offering $50 to $100 per rifle. They collected and destroyed over 2 million small arms. It had virtually no impact. The global supply was too vast. New weapons kept flowing from Eastern European stockpiles. Chinese and Russian factories continued production. C.J. Chivers, a journalist who spent years documenting the AK-47's global impact, calculated that if every arms factory stopped production today, enough AK-47s already exist to sustain current conflict levels for another 80 to 100 years. The weapon has achieved a kind of permanence. It has become a fixed feature of the global landscape. Meanwhile, Mikhail Kalashnikov was living through the chaotic collapse of the Soviet system that had created his weapon. By 1992, he was in his 70s, watching his country disintegrate and his rifle become synonymous with everything from liberation movements to terrorism. Western journalists sought him out constantly, asking the same questions. Did he regret creating the weapon? Did he feel responsibility for the millions killed by his design? His answers grew increasingly tortured. Sometimes he blamed politicians for misusing a tool designed for defense. Sometimes he took refuge in patriotism, insisting he'd served his country honorably. But in private moments, those who knew him reported a deepening sadness. In 1997, the Russian Orthodox Church invited Kalashnikov to a ceremony commemorating the 50th anniversary of his rifle's adoption. He attended, expecting celebration. Instead, the patriarch asked him, gently but directly, about the spiritual weight of his creation. Kalashnikov left the ceremony shaken. For the first time publicly, he acknowledged that the question of moral responsibility torments me more and more each year. But acknowledgement couldn't undo what existed. By 1999, the AK-47 had become the weapon of choice for Al-Qaeda. It would soon appear in the hands of insurgents in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and dozens of other conflicts. The weapon originally designed to defend the Soviet Union from fascism was now the primary tool of groups committed to violence against democratic societies. The final economic paradox of the AK-47 is this. Despite creating the most successful product in firearms history, Mikhail Kalashnikov died in relative poverty. He never received royalties. He never profited from the millions of rifles bearing his name. He lived on a modest Russian military pension in a small apartment in Izhevsk. Meanwhile, arms dealers, smugglers, warlords, and weapons manufacturers across the world had generated billions of dollars from his design. The weapon had made countless people wealthy, everyone except its creator. How does a man reconcile creating something that functions exactly as designed, but produces consequences he never intended? And what responsibility does a designer bear for how others choose to use their creation? There's a test that weapons experts use to evaluate rifle durability. It's called the insurgent standard. You take a rifle, fire 10,000 rounds through it without cleaning, bury it in a mixture of mud and sand for 72 hours, dig it up, shake off the debris, and try to fire it immediately. Most military rifles fail spectacularly. The mechanism seizes, the action jams, the weapon becomes a useless metal club. In 2006, a U.S. Army testing facility performed this evaluation on 23 different assault rifle platforms, including weapons from Russia, China, Europe, and America. 22 failed at various stages. One passed. A 38-year-old AK-47 manufactured in a Bulgarian factory in 1968. This seemingly impossible durability stems from what engineers now recognize as Kalashnikov's most revolutionary innovation. He designed the weapon to fail gracefully. Every component has enough clearance that debris doesn't stop the mechanism, it just passes through. The gas piston system is overbuilt to handle pressure variations from poor quality ammunition. The bolt carrier rides on rails so simple that nothing can prevent it from cycling. But here's the paradox that troubles modern weapons designers. By every technical metric, the AK-47 shouldn't work as well as it does. Its loose tolerances should create accuracy problems. They do, but not enough to matter at typical combat ranges. Its heavy recoil should make it uncontrollable in automatic mode. It does, but insurgents typically fire in short bursts. Its crude manufacturing should lead to parts failures. It sometimes does, but the weapon keeps functioning anyway. The AK-47 succeeds by violating every principle of precision engineering, and that's exactly why it succeeds. In 2003, when U.S. forces invaded Iraq, military planners assumed American technological superiority would quickly overwhelm Iraqi resistance. They were equipped with the latest generation of weapons: M4 carbines with advanced optics, precision-guided munitions, night vision systems, and satellite communications. Iraqi insurgents had AK-47s manufactured across 4 decades in 8 different countries, often poorly maintained and assembled from mismatched parts. Many were shooting ammunition stored in desert bunkers since the 1980s. The insurgents fought American forces to a standstill for 8 years. Not because the AK-47 was a better weapon, it wasn't, but because it was a more appropriate weapon for the conditions of urban warfare in a desert environment with minimal logistics support. This created a profound realization among military strategists. Advanced technology creates dependency. Sophisticated weapons require sophisticated support infrastructure. The more advanced your equipment, the more vulnerable you become to supply chain disruption. The AK-47 has no such dependency. It's what engineers call a mature technology. It's reached a point of optimization where further improvements are essentially impossible, not because the design is perfect, but because it's perfectly adapted to its purpose. Consider what happened in Syria starting in 2011. The conflict began with protesters armed with nothing. Within months, they'd acquired AK-47s from defecting soldiers, smuggled weapons, and captured military stockpiles. These weapons, some manufactured in the 1960s, others in the 2000s, originating from Soviet, Chinese, Egyptian, and Iraqi factories, all worked together seamlessly. Parts were interchangeable. Ammunition was universal. No training was required. By 2014, every faction in the Syrian civil war, government forces, Free Syrian Army, Kurdish militias, ISIS, Al-Qaeda affiliates, and dozens of smaller groups, was primarily armed with AK pattern rifles. In the most technologically complex conflict of the 21st century, involving drones, satellite intelligence, and precision munitions, the weapon that mattered most was a 67-year-old Soviet design. This universality created something unprecedented in military history, a completely commodified platform for violence. Unlike previous weapon systems that required specific training, supply chains, and maintenance expertise, the AK-47 had become what economists call a universal standard, like the shipping container or the USB port. Anyone could use it. Everyone understood it. It worked everywhere. But this universality also meant something darker. The weapon had become impossible to control through traditional arms control mechanisms. You can't sanction it because it's manufactured in too many countries. You can't embargo it because it's already everywhere. You can't restrict it through patents because the design is public domain. You can't make it obsolete because no alternative matches its combination of affordability, reliability, and availability. By 2010, the AK-47 had appeared in conflicts on every inhabited continent. It had become what security analysts call a conflict enabler, not the cause of wars, but the tool that made small-scale conflicts sustainable indefinitely. Remove AK-47s from Central Africa, and many conflicts would end within months, simply because combatants couldn't maintain functional weapons. But removing 20 to 30 million rifles from a region with porous borders and corrupt governments proved impossible. The United Nations, NATO, and various NGOs spent billions on weapons collection programs. The results were negligible. For every AK-47 turned in, 3 remained hidden. For every cache destroyed, 2 more were smuggled in from neighboring countries. The weapon had achieved a kind of omnipresence. Like water seeping into soil, it had permeated the global landscape so thoroughly that removal was futile. Meanwhile, new AK-47 manufacturers kept emerging. After 2000, India, Iran, Myanmar, Sudan, and Venezuela all established production facilities. The weapon's design was so simple that factories could be established with minimal investment. Unlike modern rifle manufacturing, which requires computer-controlled machinery and precision tolerances measured in microns, AK-47s could be produced with equipment from the 1950s. This created what economists call hyper-competition. So many manufacturers producing such similar products that profit margins disappear. By 2015, factories in some Eastern European countries were selling AK-47s at cost just to keep workers employed. The weapon had become so commodified that the only way to make money was through volume, which created another paradox. The cheaper AK-47s became, the more proliferated they became. And the more proliferated they became, the harder they were to control. It was a feedback loop with no exit strategy. By the time Mikhail Kalashnikov reached his 80s, he'd watched his creation spread far beyond anything he'd imagined. In 2004, reporters asked if he regretted designing the weapon. He gave an answer that revealed his internal conflict. "I sleep soundly because I created a weapon for the defense of my country." It's not my fault that politicians have used it otherwise. But even he seemed to recognize the inadequacy of that response. How do you defend creating a weapon that has killed an estimated 250,000 people annually for 6 decades? That's over 15 million deaths, more than all combat deaths in World War I. In 2007, the Russian government awarded Kalashnikov a statue in his hometown of Izhevsk. He attended the unveiling, now 88 years old, walking with assistants. In photographs from the ceremony, his expression is not triumphant. He looks tired, haunted. A man watching the world celebrate something that had brought him increasingly complex feelings. Because here's the question that no one could answer. What do you do with a weapon that has become permanent? How do you control a technology that has diffused so completely that it's become part of the basic infrastructure of global conflict? The AK-47 isn't just successful, it's achieved a kind of immortality. And immortality, Kalashnikov was learning, can be a curse. But the weapon's impact would go beyond military conflicts. It was about to become something even more troubling, a cultural symbol whose meaning shifted depending on who held it. And that transformation would haunt its creator more than any battlefield casualty count.
February 2013. Moscow's Central Museum of the Armed Forces unveils a new exhibit celebrating the AK-47's 66th anniversary. The centerpiece is a glass case containing the original 1947 prototype, its metal worn smooth by decades of testing. Surrounding it are photographs documenting the rifle's global proliferation: Vietnamese soldiers in the Mekong Delta, Afghan mujahideen in the Hindu Kush, African revolutionaries, Middle Eastern fighters, South American guerrillas. Mikhail Kalashnikov, now 93 years old and confined to a wheelchair, sits in the front row. A reporter later asked what he thought seeing his creation displayed alongside images of global conflict. His response was halting. "When I see these photographs, I wonder, was I a hero of my people, or did I cause them grief?" It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said publicly. Because by 2013, the AK-47 had transcended its function as a weapon and become something more complex and troubling. A universal symbol whose meaning depended entirely on perspective. To understand this transformation, consider what flags represent. They're symbols that convey identity, values, and allegiance. Now consider that exactly 4 national flags incorporate weapons into their design: Mozambique, Guatemala, Haiti, and Saudi Arabia. Only one features an AK-47, Mozambique, where the rifle overlays a hoe and a book, representing defense, agriculture, and education. That flag was adopted in 1983 by Frelimo, the Marxist liberation movement that fought Portuguese colonial rule. To them, the AK-47 symbolized resistance against oppression. But to human rights organizations, that same flag represents a country where AK-47s fueled decades of civil war that killed over 1 million people. Same weapon, same symbol, completely opposite meanings. This semiotic complexity extends everywhere the AK-47 appears. Hezbollah's flag features a raised AK-47 above Arabic script proclaiming resistance against Israeli occupation. Hamas propaganda posters show masked fighters wielding AK-47s against Jerusalem's skyline. Al-Qaeda recruitment videos emphasize the weapon prominently, not just as a tool, but as an icon of defiance against Western power. To the organizations using these images, the AK-47 represents legitimate armed struggle. To Western governments,
These same images represent terrorism. The weapon has become a Rorschach test, its meaning entirely dependent on the viewer's political perspective. But the symbolism goes even deeper. In hip-hop culture during the 1990s and 2000s, rappers frequently referenced the AK-47 as a symbol of street credibility and power. In action films, the weapon became cinematic shorthand for guerrilla fighters, terrorists, or drug cartels. The bad guys used AK-47s, while heroes used Western weapons. In video games, the AK-47 consistently appears as a choice for players wanting power without precision, the weapon of aggressive, close-range combat. This cultural proliferation created something unprecedented, a military weapon that had become a global icon, recognizable across every culture on Earth. Show someone the silhouette of an AK-47, and they recognize it instantly, regardless of their nationality, language, or military knowledge. The weapon's profile has achieved the same universal recognition as the Coca-Cola logo or the Christian cross. For Kalashnikov, this symbolic transformation was deeply painful. He'd designed a tool for soldiers defending the Soviet Union. Instead, his creation had become associated with revolutionary movements, both legitimate and terrorist, drug cartels, organized crime, child soldiers, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and assassinations of democrats.
In 2009, reporters asked the 90-year-old Kalashnikov whether he felt guilty about his rifle's proliferation. He responded with a question of his own. Is the creator of the knife guilty when someone uses it to kill? It's a compelling philosophical argument. Tools are morally neutral, only their use determines morality. But the AK-47 isn't a knife. A knife has countless non-violent applications. The AK-47 has exactly one purpose: to kill human beings efficiently. That specificity of purpose makes the moral question more complicated. Consider the numbers. Small arms experts estimate that AK pattern rifles have been directly responsible for approximately 250,000 deaths annually since 1970. That's 12.5 million people over 50 years. More than the total number of casualties from atomic weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons combined. Yet here's the paradox that made Kalashnikov's guilt so complex. The overwhelming majority of AK-47 deaths weren't from offensive warfare. They were from defensive combat, internal conflicts, and civil wars where determining aggressor versus defender is impossible. In Rwanda's genocide, both Hutu militias and Tutsi resistance forces used AK-47s. In Syria's civil war, every faction, government, rebels, Kurds, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, used the same weapon. Who was the aggressor? Who was the defender? The weapon didn't distinguish. This moral ambiguity tormented Kalashnikov increasingly as he aged. In 2010, the Russian Orthodox Church formally canonized several Soviet-era military figures. They did not include Kalashnikov. When asked why, a church official stated simply, "The design of weapons to kill human beings raises complex spiritual questions." That rejection wounded Kalashnikov deeply. He'd always seen himself as a patriot and a defender. To have his own church question the morality of his life's work was devastating. In 2012, at age 93, Kalashnikov wrote a private letter to the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. The letter remained confidential until after his death, but portions were later published. In it, he wrote, "The pain in my soul is unbearable. I keep asking myself the same unsolvable question. If my rifle took lives, does that mean that I,
Mikhail Kalashnikov, am responsible for people's deaths? The longer I live, the more often that question gets into my brain, the deeper I go in my thoughts and anxieties. The Patriarch's response, also published after Kalashnikov's death, was diplomatically compassionate. One must distinguish the creator of a defensive tool from those who use it for aggression. The Church does not condemn the inventor. But that absolution didn't resolve Kalashnikov's anguish. Because the AK-47 had long since stopped being merely a defensive tool, it had become the universal instrument of political violence, used by those with legitimate grievances and those with genocidal intentions, by freedom fighters and terrorists, by those defending and those attacking. In November 2013, as Kalashnikov's health declined, a Russian journalist asked him one final time about legacy and regret. His response was fragmentary, the words of a man struggling with unresolved conflict. I created a weapon to protect my country. But if I could go back, knowing what I know now. He never finished the sentence. Mikhail Kalashnikov died on December 23, 2013, at age 94, in Izhevsk, the city where his rifle had been manufactured for 66 years. Russian media portrayed him as a hero and patriot. Western obituaries were more ambivalent, noting both his technical achievement and the weapon's catastrophic global impact. But here's what almost no coverage mentioned. Kalashnikov died, effectively broke. Despite creating the world's most proliferated weapon, a design that generated billions in revenue for manufacturers worldwide, he never received royalties. Soviet patent law had given the state ownership of his design. After the Soviet collapse, Russian law never corrected this. He lived on a modest military pension in a small apartment with few luxuries. The final paradox of his life, he'd created immense value, but captured almost none of it. He'd achieved global fame, but died troubled by what that fame represented. He'd designed a weapon that worked exactly as intended, but produced consequences he never desired. Was he responsible? Should he have felt guilt? Could he have prevented what his creation became? These questions haunted him to his death, and they remain unresolved because the weapon he created isn't finished shaping history. It's still here, still proliferating, still killing, and still posing the same uncomfortable questions about technology, morality, and unintended consequences. But the story doesn't end with Kalashnikov's death, because the weapon has entered a new and potentially more dangerous phase. The era of digital manufacturing, 3D printing, and technologies that could make the AK-47 even more impossible to control than it already is. What happens when a weapon that can't be controlled becomes infinitely replicable?
September 2017. A weapons factory in Izhevsk, Russia, the same facility where Mikhail Kalashnikov first saw his design mass-produced 70 years earlier, begins manufacturing the AKD Continuar-12, the latest evolution of the original platform. Engineers have added tactical rails, improved ergonomics, enhanced accuracy, and modern materials. But the core mechanism, the gas piston system, the rotating bolt, the overall design philosophy remains unchanged from 1947. This continuity reveals something profound. The AK-47 isn't just a successful weapon. It's reached what biologists call an evolutionary stable state, a design so well adapted to its environment that further changes make it worse, not better.
Every attempt to improve the AK-47 has failed. The AK-74, 1974, uses a smaller caliber round that's more accurate but less reliable with poor quality ammunition. The AN-94, 1994, incorporates a complex two-round burst mechanism that improves accuracy but requires maintenance. The AK-12, 2012, adds modern features but costs 3 times as much to manufacture. None have replaced the original AK-47. In 2024, the rifles being used in Ukraine's conflict include specimens manufactured in the 1960s, fighting alongside models produced last year. 7 decades of production, all functionally identical. But the AK-47's future isn't about factory production. It's about something far more troubling: digital replication. In 2013, a Texas-based group called Defense Distributed successfully 3D printed a functional firearm. The technology was crude. The weapon worked for 1 or 2 shots before catastrophic failure, but it demonstrated proof of concept. Firearms could be manufactured digitally by anyone, anywhere, with no serial numbers, no regulation, and no oversight. By 2018, the technology had advanced significantly. A group in Europe published digital files for a 3D printed AK-47 receiver, the one component that legally constitutes a firearm under most regulations. Every other part could be purchased legally as spare parts. With a 3D printer costing $2,000 and metal-capable printers now available for under $5,000, anyone with technical knowledge could manufacture an untraceable AK-47 at home. This creates a scenario that would have horrified Kalashnikov, his weapon becoming completely impossible to control, track, or regulate. If AK-47 files become as widely distributed as music files, then weapons control becomes as futile as stopping digital piracy. But here's what makes the AK-47 specifically dangerous in this context. Unlike modern rifles that require precision manufacturing, the AK-47's loose tolerances make it ideal for 3D printing. The mechanism can tolerate variations in part dimensions. Components don't need perfect alignment. The design inherently compensates for manufacturing imprecision. Kalashnikov accidentally created the perfect weapon for the digital age, 70 years before that age began. Currently, international arms control treaties attempt to regulate firearms through manufacturer oversight, serial number tracking, and export controls. All of these mechanisms assume physical manufacturing in regulated facilities. Digital manufacturing bypasses every single control mechanism. A person in Australia could download AK-47 files from a server in Iceland, print the parts in their garage, and assemble a functional weapon, all without crossing any borders or triggering any regulations. This isn't hypothetical. In 2022, Australian police raided a suburban home and discovered a small-scale 3D printing operation producing AK pattern rifles for criminal organizations. The manufacturer had no firearms training, no engineering degree, and no connection to traditional arms trafficking. He'd learned everything from YouTube tutorials and online forums. The implication is staggering. The weapon that already can't be controlled might become infinitely replicable. So where does this leave us? 77 years after a wounded Soviet tank commander sketched designs in a hospital, the AK-47 has become more than a weapon. It's a permanent feature of human civilization. Like the wheel, the printing press, or the internal combustion engine, it's a technology that has diffused so completely that it cannot be uninvented or controlled. Current estimates suggest 100 to 150 million AK pattern rifles exist globally, but that number is almost certainly low. Weapons manufactured in conflict zones, illicit factories, and now digital manufacturing facilities never appear in official counts. The true number could exceed 200 million, roughly one AK-47 for every 40 people on Earth.
These weapons don't degrade significantly. An AK-47 manufactured in 1960 remains functional in 2024.
With minimal maintenance, they'll remain functional in 2050, 2075, 2010. Unlike electronic devices or vehicles, rifles don't have planned obsolescence. They're among the most durable objects humans manufacture. This means that even if every factory stopped production today, enough AK-47s already exist to supply global conflicts for another century. The weapon has achieved a form of immortality, not through continued production, but through sheer durability and overwhelming numbers. What would Mikhail Kalashnikov think if he could see this future? The question is unanswerable, but his final years provide clues. After decades of ambivalence, his 2012 letter to the Russian Orthodox Patriarch revealed genuine anguish. He died, troubled by what he'd created. Not the mechanism itself, but its consequences. Yet here's the final paradox. Even if Kalashnikov had never lived, someone else would have designed something functionally equivalent. The Soviet military's 1946 requirements for a simple, reliable automatic rifle would have eventually produced a similar weapon. The AK-47 succeeded not because of Kalashnikov's unique genius, but because it solved a problem that demanded solution. This raises the deepest question. Is individual moral responsibility meaningful when historical forces make certain technologies inevitable? Kalashnikov struggled with this question his entire life. He designed a weapon for defense, but it became a tool for every form of violence. He created something to protect the Soviet Union, but it outlasted that nation by decades. He hoped for recognition and prosperity, but died in relative obscurity and modest circumstances. Today, his creation remains the most proliferated weapon in human history. It has killed more people than any other small arm ever designed. It has enabled conflicts that would otherwise have been economically unsustainable. It has become a symbol whose meaning shifts between liberation and terror, depending on who holds it. And it continues spreading. In 2023, new conflict zones in sub-Saharan Africa, Myanmar, and Latin America all featured combatants primarily armed with AK pattern rifles. Some of these weapons were manufactured in the 1960s, some were produced last year. All of them work. The AK-47 has achieved what few technologies accomplish. It has become immortal, universal, and impossible to control. Mikhail Kalashnikov died, but his creation will outlive everyone currently alive. It will remain functional, available, and deadly for generations after the last person who knew him personally has died. Is that legacy one of achievement or tragedy? Hero or cautionary tale? Defender of nations or enabler of violence? The answer, like the weapon itself, depends entirely on perspective. And that ambiguity, the impossibility of definitively judging whether the AK-47 represents humanity's ingenuity or our capacity for sustained violence, is perhaps the most troubling aspect of all.
A statue of Mikhail Kalashnikov stands today in central Moscow. Unveiled in 2017, it depicts him holding his rifle, expression stoic, representing Soviet engineering triumph. But there's a detail that many visitors miss. The sculptor included an AK-47 silhouette that, upon close inspection, incorporates subtle design elements from the German St. G-44, the weapon that inspired Kalashnikov's creation. The error was unintentional but symbolically perfect.
Because the AK-47 was never purely original. It was a synthesis of existing ideas, adapted brilliantly for specific conditions. Its genius wasn't innovation, but optimization. When the error was discovered, critics demanded the statue's removal. Russian officials refused, arguing that the design inspiration reflected historical reality rather than diminishing Kalashnikov's achievement. The statue remains, a permanent testament to a weapon's complicated legacy. Here's what changed because of the AK-47. For the first time in modern history, political violence became economically accessible to anyone. Sustaining armed conflict no longer required industrial capacity, complex supply chains, or state backing. A small group with modest funding could now arm themselves with military-grade weapons and fight indefinitely. This democratization of lethality reshaped global power structures. It made conventional military superiority less decisive. It enabled prolonged conflicts that killed millions. It made certain regions essentially ungovernable. And it created a permanent reservoir of accessible violence that continues enabling conflicts across the world. But it also enabled genuine liberation movements. The AK-47 armed those resisting colonialism, apartheid, and oppression when no other options existed. It gave the powerless a tool to resist the powerful. Whether you view this as justified depends entirely on which liberation movements you support, and that subjectivity is the weapon's deepest complexity. Mikhail Kalashnikov spent his final years recognizing this complexity. He understood that his creation was neither purely good nor purely evil. It was a tool whose morality depended on the hands holding it and the causes they served. That understanding brought him no peace. The world transformed in unexpected ways because of his design. Conflicts that should have ended from resource exhaustion continued indefinitely. Small arms became the primary weapon of modern warfare, killing far more people than bombs or missiles. And a weapon designed to defend one nation became the universal tool for political violence worldwide. Today, somewhere in the world, an AK-47 is being fired. In conflict zones, at shooting ranges, in criminal violence, in self-defense. The weapon Kalashnikov designed in 1947 continues functioning exactly as intended, reliably, simply, endlessly. And that reliability, that simple endurance, may be the most sobering legacy of all. Because the AK-47 proved something about human nature that we might prefer not to know. Given access to reliable tools of violence, humans will use them, continuously, globally, and without end. Kalashnikov died hoping his creation would be remembered as defending the innocent. Instead, it became something more complicated. A mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both resistance and atrocity, for liberation and oppression, for self-defense and aggression. The rifle he designed will outlast everyone reading these words. It will remain functional, available, and deadly long after current conflicts end and new ones begin. It has achieved a form of permanence that few human creations ever accomplish. Whether that permanence represents triumph or tragedy remains the question Mikhail Kalashnikov died unable to answer. And perhaps that's the truest statement of all. The most influential weapon in modern history leaves us not with certainty, but with an enduring, uncomfortable question about what we've built and what it's built in return.